What is a self-managed super fund? It is just a little super fund. You can have up to 4 people, so it doesn't have to be 4. It can be 1, 2, 3 or 4. Typically it's family members, but again, it doesn't have to be. And we do have a few situations where some friends or mates are coming together and banding together to get enough in their fund so they can go and get a property. So particularly younger blokes that quite like what they're hearing but haven't been in super long, they are teaming up with a few other friends, getting enough in super to go and get a property, and then their broad plan is to hang on to it until they've either paid off the loan or it's doubled in price or something like that, and then they'll probably sell it and split out and have enough to have their own self-managed super fund. It is at the end of the day just a specialised trust. What you do need to be careful of is that everyone who is a member of the super fund is a trustee. Or another thing that people do, and one of the examples tonight in fact does it, is where you might see mum and dad bring in an adult child into their self-managed super fund to give them a bit of a leg up. Again, you need to be mindful if you're going to do something like that, that they also will be having a say in what goes on. So in some families that might be great, in others it might be a little bit of a challenge. And obviously you guys will be better judges of your families than what we will. But it's there as a possibility to do. The key thing, and it really is fundamentally what drives the vast overwhelming majority of people into self-managed super funds, is you get control of what your fund's investing in. So it really does mean self-managed means self-managed. You get to decide what you buy, when you sell it, how much and so forth. You literally have a checkbook in your possession. It's not at all controlled by someone else in terms of what you're buying and selling. And of course property fits it marvellously, because that's what for most people they actually genuinely understand. So rather than basically handing off your money, which could now be quite a lot for you, to someone else who you're probably never going to meet in all your life, someone in Sydney, they might even be in New York, now it can be you investing that money into things that you understand, and you can indeed with property drive past it if you like. The next couple of bits though on the tax is the same for all super funds, big or small. We all have the same tax regime. But what we generally find is, because most people have had a pretty poor super experience, they've never heard the good bits. And I guess in a sense you could say, well, it's probably a reasonable attitude, because it's not much fun or point of me crowing about the low tax rates if they've been losing your money anyway. But if we suddenly can say, well, let's go self-managed and put it into something you know and understand and control, and there's also all these marvellous low tax rates, it really sparks people up. You'll find that whilst you're in accumulation phase, so when you're still working and sticking money into your super fund, it gets taxed at 15% on its earnings. So that's typically going to be your interest, your rents and your dividends are your main 3 things that people have that they're earning money from in their super fund. So it's 15%, which of course is lower certainly than most of the population, and for those of you who are unfortunately getting stung at 46.5 cents, it's quite a lot lower. Then on capital gains, whilst you're still working in accumulation phase, providing the super fund has owned that asset for 12 months or more, then the capital gains rate is only 10%. So again, significantly less than what you would be paying outside of super. So it's all quite attractive as you're in accumulation phase, but where it gets marvellous, and lots of people don't seem to know this, is that when you get to pension phase or retirement stage, typically 60 and retired, the tax rate is indeed literally 0. So it's 0 on the capital gains, it's 0 on the earnings. So if you buy a property for $500,000, you sit on it for 15 years and then you hit 60 and you retire, and you sell it for say $1.5 million, and there's $1 million capital gain there, then the tax is literally 0. And then the other great part is then the pension that super fund is paying out to you, that is also tax-free to you as well. So it truly is a tax-free 0 result right through the whole chain. And lots of people don't seem to know that. And of course, you'll see with the examples we do tonight, we will work that pretty hard. In terms of then getting money into super and get a tax deduction, then the year we're standing in, the financial year we're standing in with about 8 trading days left or whatever it is, then if you are under 50, you can put $25,000 into super and get a tax deduction. If you're 50 and over, then you can put $50,000 into super and get a tax deduction. Unfortunately, next year, so about 10 days away, July, everyone is stuck on $25,000. If you want to get money into super and not claim a tax deduction, you can do that too, and you can put in $150,000 in 1 year, or you can even squash up 3 years' worth into one and put $450,000 in. So if we have a couple, particularly in the financial year we're standing in, over 50, they can put $450,000 in and not claim a tax deduction, plus another 50 and claim a deduction, so they can put $500,000 in, or $1 million into super in 1 year as a couple. So it is still possible to get a lot of money into a super fund quite quickly in one go. Now, of course, not everyone's got $450,000 worth of cash just sloshing around, but most people find at some point in their lives, every now and then they do. You've got an investment property and you've sold it, and probably what you were going to do until you came tonight was just turn around and get another one. But now, hopefully, after hearing what you hear tonight, you might go and take 100 or 200 of that and put it into your super, so that you can go and get a property in your super fund as well. In terms of what it can do and what it can own, essentially it can buy all the main types of investments that you'd expect to want to be able to buy. It can buy shares. We won't talk about that terribly much tonight, and lots of super funds do that. They can even buy them off yourself if they are listed shares, and that can be pretty handy, particularly for self-employed people in the room. What you'll see someone do is they've had some shares at the start of the year, did well, they sold them, made a capital gain, $20,000, got some other shares, particularly at the moment, that are underwater. They go and transfer those shares into their super fund and trigger a $20,000 capital loss, got rid of the capital gain, and then they are allowed to go and claim that, say, $50,000 worth of shares they put in as their contribution into super and get a tax deduction. So from the same set of shares, you can save, in a sense, 2 lots of tax. Got rid of the capital gain, and you got a tax deduction for contributing into super. It is possible to buy unlisted stuff, but it can't be from associates, and that can be quite complicated. So if you want to do something like that, you will definitely need to talk to us probably at length. What we're really interested in, and what certainly borrowing in super is beautifully designed for, is this: buying property. If you want to buy commercial property, you can buy that off yourself, but with residential, you are not allowed to buy a residential property off yourself or your associates into your super fund. So unfortunately, if you have already got a rental property and you think, gee, I'd like to bring it into my super fund, you can't. You are going to have to buy a new one, and we've got plenty of people here that would like to help you out in that particular matter. But that's basically what you can buy anything that you ordinarily would expect to be able to buy investment-wise. You're not particularly restricted. Borrowing super, there's a few rules. The loan must be non-recourse. That's actually a positive. What that means is, if we've got a super fund and this person's actually got quite a bit of money in their super fund already, say $200,000 in shares, and they go and buy a property with a super loan, and unfortunately somehow or another they've chosen very poorly and it's had to be sold, and it's got sold for less than the loan, $50,000 short, well, the banks are not allowed to say, right, well, we're 50 grand short, so we'll have 50 grand's worth of your shares in your super fund. However, you'll probably find they'll still get personal guarantees off you, and they might be able to get 50 grand off you in your personal name. But in terms of your other assets in your super fund, they cannot touch it. You can only have a single loan, single asset situation, which for property is fine. You buy one property, one loan, it's not terribly much of a problem. As we'll talk about briefly, it's a real issue for shares, unfortunately. So you can certainly buy shares without borrowing in super quite easily. But if you're going to borrow and buy shares, it's pretty hard and pretty expensive. You can't borrow to improve an asset, so it is something that you really are looking at something that's nice and new, doesn't need a lot of work. So this is not a product that works well for a fixer-upper, needs a lot of TLC type arrangement. You are looking at something that is essentially new and doesn't need a whole heap of work. The banks have got their rules and they've got their loan value ratios, so that's taught, they'll lend residential. Some of them will talk about lending at 80%, but generally it's 70% when you get into the deal. So they'll lend 70% of the value of the property. Commercial, probably 65%. You might squeeze a 70% out of someone. So it's not terribly much different to the loan ratios you'll get outside of super. And you can get, 30-year mortgages, 5 years interest-free, these sorts of, interest-only I should say, these sorts of things inside super now as well. There's not really much difference between the sort of deal you'll get on a super loan versus a normal loan outside of super. You'll find, technically, the tax office would let you do this, but the banks won't. You'll find you will not be able to get a super loan for just a vacant block that's not earning any rent. So it's going to need a property on it and earning some rent. What we generally like, and most of the examples, if not all of them tonight, are situations where the property, if it's negatively geared, it'll only be mildly so. And we really like that because what that means is then if you're putting any extra money into super, it can all be directed towards paying off the loan. And that's a marvellous little advantage there. So if we've got someone in the top bracket and they're putting in their $25,000, they're going to save $11,600 odd of tax in their own name. Now, one thing that does take a little bit of the shine off and you need to be mindful of is that when you put money into a super fund and you or your boss claims a tax deduction, it's income of the fund, and so there must be that 15% paid. So the super fund would have to send off the $3,750. But overall, this person is nearly $8,000 in tax in front. So of course, if you've put that money into the super fund and it could have been directed towards paying off the loan, you've basically got the ATO paying off a third of the principal of the loan. Not negative gearing where it's only interest, it's the principal that we're getting a tax deduction on. And there is no other way to get a tax deduction for paying off the principal of a loan than this via a super fund. How much do I need in super? You'll find if you read an article in the paper or a finance magazine or something like that, that's the number that generally gets bandied around. We'll have examples tonight using 150 and we've done some that are even lower. So probably in terms of property and borrowing, the more correct answer is it really is a property by property transaction. I have even done a property as low as having 80,000 in super and we were able to make the sums work. But generally that's probably the number we like to see before we start doing something. But where that, particularly the 200,000 is coming from, is an economies of scale argument. So if you're with one of the big retail funds, they'll generally charge 1.8 to 2% of your funds. So if you've got 100,000 in super, they're going to charge you, let's say, $1,800 a year for having the pleasure of them run your money. With a self-managed super fund, we charge on the basis of how much work we've got to do. And unfortunately, whether there's $1 in it or $1 million in there, there's certain things we have to do. We have to do the profit and loss, the balance sheet, the tax return, and they do have to be audited every year. And so for us, we're saying if you go and buy a property with a super loan, we're probably going to find you're going to have to be charged about $2,500 a year. So at 100,000, they obviously win the race. $1,800 is obviously less than $2,500. But as you build your wealth, and this is the beauty of self-managed and the beauty of a property, is that if you get to 200,000, well, of course, those guys are still charging you the 1.8, and they're now taking $3,600 off you. But from our point of view, a property, whether it's worth $500,000 or $1 million, it doesn't cause us any more work. There's the rent, and that's just a number. We plug it in and so forth. So as your wealth builds in a self-managed super fund, and particularly with property, because it doesn't cause us lots and lots of work. If you want to go share trading, well, yes, it does. But if you want to buy property, it builds in wealth, it goes up in wealth over time, and it doesn't cause us any more work to do. And to give you, I suppose, more extreme examples, we've got self-managed funds where there might be $3 to $4 million in them, so a well-to-do doctor or something like that, and we're charging them $5,000 to $6,000 in fees, whilst, of course, if they were those guys, they'd be looking at a fee that might be $50,000, because it's just simply a percentage on what they've got under management. So as your wealth builds, particularly if you've gone property and self-managed, you'll be very pleased with yourself because your fees will be far less than what they would be with retail or industry funds. Now we've got some examples here, and I think we've probably got something from everyone, something probably for a younger couple that might have young kids and not a lot of surplus dough in the family budget, through to something a little bit more fancier, certainly the display home. And this is where we will show you, you can do more than just a husband and wife situation, and then something in the middle, I suppose, there, where someone might be closing in on perhaps more like 50 years of age with a bit more in super, but just a husband and wife. So here's the sort of background info. We've got Jack and Jill. They've spotted a spec home, a home buyer centre spec home that they like. We've got Jack, he's on $100,000, and we've got Jill, who's on $40,000, so might be a part-time mum or something like that. We're getting their 9% supers. Now, of course, you might say, well, hang on, 9% on 100 is $9,000, but I've taken that 15% tax off already. So we've got $7,650 for Jack and a touch over $3,000 for Jill. In the modelling that we've got sitting behind this, we give them, just inflationary pay rises and inflationary rent rises each year on the property. We've got the interest rate at 7.5. You could in fact get a loan quite a bit less than that at the moment. We do assume no vacancy period, and obviously that can happen from time to time. In terms of the property going up in value, we just do it at 5. To put that in a bit of perspective, that sort of double in 10 years rule of thumb, which obviously is a little bit hard at the moment, but that would require a 7. We're only doing a 5. And of course you might remember from the Seeds of Discontent slide, of course a 5 was as good as any of those other alternatives were doing anyway, so we're not trying to say we're doing it any better than them. And then this couple have got $150,000 in super combined. They're buying a property that costs $286,000, including the stamp duty, so they need a loan of $136,000 and it's earning $310 rent a week. So how does that look when we plug in the sums? So you've got your basic sort of profit and loss, you've got your rent up the top, management agent, doesn't have to be managed, you could do it yourself, but most people get an agent in to manage it. Repairs, which is probably overstating it in the early days because we are talking about a brand new building. Council rates, water rates, you've got your interest bill, bit of an extra in there just in case for something else. And the beauty of that then is this property actually has got a cash profit. So that's great. We've covered the interest bill, all the other costs, and there's a little bit left over. So that does then mean if we're putting any extra into this fund, we can direct the whole thing to paying off the loan. Then of course you've got the 2.5% depreciation that probably most of you are aware of. So if you're buying a rental property and it's a relatively new building, then there is a 2.5% depreciation. It gets called eligible building allowance, but it's depreciation. And that's great from a tax point of view, so we can take this $2,400 off the $1,650, so book profit is actually showing a loss. So that'll actually lower the tax bill of the super fund, leaves more money aside to pay even more off the loan. So how does that all look? So you can see here we started off with that loan and we've got the $150,000 odd in super to start with, and then you can see we've got rid of that loan in, well, a little bit over the 8 years, started off $150,000 in super, and they're now closing in on having nearly $500,000, I should say, in this super at the end of the 10 years. On to the more swankier one, the very nice display home up at Elkamos. And this is where I have introduced a third player, their adult daughter Mary. So they've decided, well, Mary's pretty unhappy what's happening with her super. She probably doesn't have enough to set up her own self-managed super fund, so the family's teaming up together and bringing Mary in as well. Same story, Jack's only on the 100 still, Jill on the 40, and I've got Mary on 50,000. So they are still, again, not high flyers by any stretch. There's their super situations, same sort of modelling, 3% pay rises and rent increases, and off we go, property going up at 5%. We've got 230,000 in super between them. Now, of course, the beautiful part of the display home is we're getting those very high rents at the start whilst it's in display home status. So we've got 666 there a week, and then after the property falls out of display home status, it'll fall down to about $500 a week. But it's great because it gets us off to a really roaring start in getting rid of that loan. So there's your little profit and loss. We're getting the 7% yield at the start of the story. All the usual expenses you've already seen. So at the start you don't have to pay an agent because it's display home. You're not paying repairs and maintenance. So you get out of a few expenses as well. And then we get down to the end here, and of course look at that cash flow profit. $11,000 because you're getting such a nice big juicy rent and so we've got 11,000 coming in, plus we've got 3, in this case, 9% supers coming in to pay this loan off. But, you know, we still get the 2.5% depreciation, we can pull it off, so we're only going to have to pay tax on the 4, even though we earn the 11. So very, very handy. So how does that look? Well, it looks pretty juicy. We've got a situation again where we had a fairly large loan, and again, as it happens, the next column would, in a sense, might have been handy. It's gone in year 11, and we've got a situation where they had about 230,000 at the start of year 1, and now they're closing in on 800,000 10 years later. And again, it does have the advantage of 3 people chipping in their 9%, but that is all we have used, just their 9%. So you can see the power of teaming up with a few extra people. More base plus an extra 1 or 2 9% coming in, you really whiz through a loan, even on a big property like this one. In terms of sort of a bit of a comparison between, do I go and do this or just keep doing what I'm doing, we've got the 3 sort of sets of people here. So the young couple, I suppose you might say, with the 150,000 super, if they stay in standard average retail super, earning that 5%, the best number on that page, then they're going to end up with a bit over 300, probably closing on 350. But if they go and buy the property, by virtue of the 9%, but also the negative, the gearing aspect, the property is going up 5%, but over a much bigger value than just the 150. They're getting an excellent result here, and they're closing in on the 500 we saw. You see the display home, having 3 people contributing in is magnificent for building up the wealth. And in the middle of the road story again, well clear of just doing the same old, same old. What we try to get across, and you're probably starting to realise it a bit already, I guess, is just the power of self-managed borrowing over negative gearing borrowing in conventional property purchases. So let's say we have got a rental property and it's about $5,000 negative gear. So you rent, take away your interest bill and your other costs, it's $5,000 loss. And the bank wants the loan paid off and they want about $10,000 of the loan paid off a year. So you've got to find $15,000 for the year before we do any tax or whatever else. Got to make up the $5,000 loss, and we've got to pay $10,000 off the actual principal of the loan. Now, if you go and buy that property normal, conventional negative gearing, then Mr. Negative Gearing, when he comes to do his tax return, he has had to find $15,000, but he can only put the $5,000 loss in his tax return. And he's probably in the 38.5 cents bracket, so he's going to save around about $2,000 in tax. Mr. Self-Managed Super Fund, however, he goes and sacrifices the 15 into his super fund, and so he's going to get a tax deduction over the whole 15, not just the 5. So he is effectively getting that tax deduction over paying the principal of the loan. Poor old Mr. Negative Gearing, he's stuck on just the 5, but Mr. Super Fund, he's getting the tax deduction over the full $15,000. So from year to year, Mr. Self-Managed Super Fund's having a clear win over the negative gearing fella, and looking pretty good for doing it. But then where it gets wonderful, of course, is at the capital gains end of the story. So, we'll go back to that rough little example I talked about at the start. You've bought a $500,000 rental property, and you've sat on it, let's say, for about the 15 years, which is broadly, and that's going to go up to $1.5 million. That's broadly in line with that doubling in 10 years type rule. So now we've got a property that cost us $500,000. It's worth $1.5 million. We've waited the 15 years till we've retired. Now, Mr. Negative Gearing, his calculation will be bought it for $500,000, sold it for $1.5 million capital gain. Now, he can, of course, say, I've owned it more than 12 months, so I get that standard 50% discount off the capital gain. So that $1 million gets chopped down to $500,000. So that's very handy. But it means he still has to literally put $500,000 into his tax return that year. So straight up to the top tax bracket if he's not there already, and he's going to pay nearly half of that in tax. So he'll have a tax bill approaching $250,000. Mr. Self-Managed Super Fund, however, has had the same calculation, bought for $500,000, sold for $1.5 million capital gain, but what's his tax rate? 0. No tax bill whatsoever. So we've got poor old Mr. Negative Gearing. he was only getting the tax deduction on the $5,000 a year. Mr. Super Fund's getting $15,000 deduction every year, and then when we get to the end of the story, he's getting the $250,000 tax bill, and Mr. Super Fund gets nothing. So, you know, a clear, enormous advantage to self-managed super. Probably is a little bit of salt in the wound as well, is we've been talking about that 2.5% depreciation. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is in a sense you end up giving half of that back. So, I'll give an extremely exaggerated example, and it is exaggerated. Let's say you bought a property for $400,000 and it was basically $200,000 of land value, $200,000 of construction or building cost. And over the time we've owned it, we've claimed $100,000 worth of depreciation. And we've now sold that house, we've doubled our money, we've sold it for $800,000. Now you'd be thinking, right, well the calculation is sold it for $800,000, bought it for $400,000, there's a $400,000 capital gain. Well, in actual fact, no it's not. The capital gains calculation is $800,000, take $300,000, because I've eaten up $100,000 worth of the cost base over the years claiming the depreciation. So poor old Mr. Negative Gearing, in actual fact, he's got a $500,000 capital gain under that story. Yes, he can chop it in half, but he is going to have to pay tax on 50 of that 100 he claimed previously over the years. Mr. Self-Managed Super Fund, of course, same calculation, 800, 300, there's a $500,000 gain, but what's his tax rate? 0, nothing given back. So he walks away keeping the whole lot. Poor old Mr. Negative Gearing had to give half of it back at the end of the story. So, you know, it's just so much more a powerful way to buy property. And it is going to mean then that if you buy a good property, you know, you're just going to be so happy you bought it in your self-managed super fund, because you're going to know at the end of the story, all the gain is yours, the whole lot. No one's going to get any of it. Negative gearing, you still will do well, but at the end of the story, you are going to know that you're going to have to give Mr. Taxman a fair whack of it. The other thing too here, I suppose, that we point out is that, of course, before tonight, if you were sort of in the market, you know, you probably wouldn't be here if you wouldn't. You're in the market for looking and buying an investment property, and you've probably been thinking conventional negative gearing until tonight. You might have even got a bit of a pre-approval from the bank. They said, look, you're good for $500,000 buying a conventional negative geared property. But of course, what this opens up is the possibility you can go and get two properties. Because when the bank said, yep, you're good for $500,000, they weren't using your super in terms of what you got in your super right now, and they weren't using your 9% in terms of how you service that loan, because they can't get at it. So they've worked that out without reference to your superannuation. Now, as you've seen tonight, you can go and get a loan in your super fund, and of course they use what they didn't use over here, the whatever you got in your super now, say $150,000 and your 9%. So it does create the possibility you can go and get two loans. So if you do think it's a pretty good time to go and buy some properties, you can potentially go and get two. I haven't seen anyone do it simultaneously, but some people do come back for the second one once they've bedded down the first. Another little strategy, which again just shows that, you know, the wonderful possibilities with a self-managed super fund is this dream home retirement one. So typically it's high income earners, but it doesn't have to be. So you've identified some very nice, say a very fancy display home you like, perhaps down south or something. It's got all the nice features on it. Perhaps you don't have enough money to buy it outside of super, but you've got some money in super. You go and buy it in your super fund, you get a super loan. And then over the years, you then sacrifice or contribute as much into super as you can to get the bill, pay the loan off, plus you're getting the tax deduction for doing it. You've got the loan paid off, you've had all the tax deductions for paying off the principal of the loan. You've now turned 60, it's time to retire. And so now, what a lot of people don't realise is you are allowed to transfer the house out of the super fund. So when you want to take some wealth out of super, it doesn't have to be cash. It can be an asset. So now we take the house out of the super fund and put it back in our own names. We now own it. We can live in it. We can stay in it. It's ours now. And the beautiful part is that because it was Jack and Jill over here in the self-managed super fund, and it's going to Jack and Jill outside the self-managed super fund, no stamp duty. And of course, as you've seen, heard me go on and on really. Of course, we've waited to a 60. Tax rate for the super fund is 0. There's probably an enormous capital gain on this property, but it doesn't matter because the tax rate's 0. So we've got it out, no stamp duty and no capital gains tax, back in our own name. So you, beauty, we've got this beautiful home that we can retire to, and we've got all these tax deductions along the way to help pay off the loan. But of course you might say, well, that's fine, but your super fund just went zero and you've probably just emptied the whole thing out, or near enough too. So, a little bit dumb. But of course, the wonderful part here is that you've been living somewhere else. Your family home, your existing one, probably everyone knows you can sell that without capital gains tax, so you sell that one because you're not living it anymore, you're going to live in the dream home. You sold the family home, no capital gains tax, you've got a whole heap of dough in your hands, and as we discussed at the start, a couple can get, from next financial year onwards, you could get $950,000 into your super fund in one go. So we've now got the $950,000 back into the super, getting taxed at zero for the rest of their days, pension that's being paid to them, tax-free in their own names, and you got your dream home. So it's a real cake and eat it too type story. And these are the beaut things you can do with a self-managed super fund. Now, of course, the other thing, and we've briefly touched on it already, is new versus old, and particularly if we're going to talk about a borrowing situation, I think you'll find that going new makes enormous sense with rental property. Most of the people I'm dealing with this product, they really do want a pretty stress-free investment. So little repairs. You're going to have a nice new property, so you should be getting a premium rent compared to other older properties. You've got all the structural guarantee in front of you at the start. As I said, less complaints as a result. You've got all of the 2.5% depreciation in front of you, and as we discussed, super funds get to hang on to the whole lot if you wait till you retire. And as we've also mentioned, you can't borrow and improve an asset. So you can't go and borrow and then borrow some more money to fix up this older reno type job. You just aren't allowed to do that according to the tax office rules. So it really is something that is very well designed for a nice new property. Now, miscellaneous issues, this is where I suppose we deal with a few of the things that people get a bit worried about with super. And number one's that one. I've never done a seminar where people don't bring that up, and it's quite right. They do change the rules. At the minimum, we have the budget every year, and they can't help themselves. They'll have to have a bit of a fiddle. But what people don't realise is they get grandfathered. So I think what most people are sort of fearful of is the thing, right, okay, you put on a pretty good seminar here, but no, my luck, I'll go and do it on Monday, and they'll change the rules on Tuesday. But what people don't realise is that whenever they have done that, they get grandfathered. So they'll say, right, all you people that got in yesterday and before, you get to keep the old rules, and all you people that come from today or tomorrow, you've got the new rules. So you have that protection. So it's really more of an argument probably to hurry up rather than sit on your hands and say, oh, there's no point in doing it anyway because they'll probably change the rules. Get in while the rules are attractive and get them locked in. There's no absolute guarantees of that, but that's what has always happened, and there's enormous pressure on the government to honour that. You think of these solar rebates and whatever else where they announce sort of in the middle of the night that they're cutting them back, and they're saying to anyone who got in, you've got it, because if they go retrospective, they'll never get people to do anything ever again. Because if they did that, you'd say, well, I'm not doing that because I saw what happened to the solar people. So it's very difficult for them not to go for a grandfathered approach. Another thing that gets people a bit worried, of course, is, well, how much work is all this? Is it a second job just about, or what is it? But really that probably exaggerates it. The first year getting your property bought and set up and whatever else, you'll have a bit of mucking around with us, but again, we're talking hours, not vast amounts. From year to year, though, from your point of view, really, it's just one more tax return, come into your account and have a yarn for half an hour or so, done. Property's being managed by someone, send it in. It's not going to be a second job. The only time it might be a bit more than that is perhaps when you're getting ready to buy the second property and you want to have a few discussions with the accountant about how you're going to go about it and so forth. So it is not a great onerous undertaking. And then the other broad point we make to people, if you haven't really cottoned on it already, is of course as you start marching towards particularly the magic number of 60, you really are trying to get as much of your money into that self-managed super fund as you can, because the dream outcome is you're 59 and 364 days old, you have your 60th birthday, and your present is that you've got all your wealth in your self-managed super fund, because self-managed, you control what it gets spent on, invested on and run. You've got full access to it if you want it. It'd be a bit silly to go and empty it out, but you do have full access to the funds, and of course it's getting taxed at zero, and the pension it's paying you is also tax-free. So there's no negative left. You've got full control, full access, and you're getting taxed at zero. So if I haven't won you over already, this is my last slide or so to do so. So just recapping. Again, that's what pulls most people to self-managed, is a frustration with seeing very poor results and not really being able to do anything about it in retail super, just having to take your medicine. With self-managed super, of course, you can. You bring the money over into your super bank account, you've got the checkbook, and you invest it when you're ready into what you want to invest it into. And of course with property, beautiful, you know, almost the ultimate control. You can drive past it if you like, as opposed to being told you're 30% overseas shares, and what does that mean? This is talking about I own number 18 Jones Street and I can go and drive past it. And of course the other thing you find with property is people understand it. I've done seminars to property developer associations and so forth, and of course you make the point, you know, if you grab, you know, this room or any other 100 Aussies and say, right, what are going to be over the next 10 years, what are going to be the 10 best performing shares or funds, you know, who are those? Well, I don't know who it is, they certainly don't, but if you say, can you go and pick out a nice property in a good subdivision somewhere, well, yes they can, relatively easily. The other wonderful thing we do see with self-managed, on our client base, there's a clear divide between people that are still in retail super or an industry fund versus self-managed. You'll generally find with the retail people that they resent, generally speaking, every last dollar of their money that goes into super. And on the self-managed side, and they'll be complaining about how much is going in, on the self-managed side, we find the biggest complaint is how little they're allowed to put in. It's self-managed where it works. It's self-managed is where people volunteering to put more into their super to prepare for their retirement. And the key difference why? They've got control. So you see what super was really supposed to do happen in self-managed land. And, you know, that low tax environment, I've probably hammered that point home well enough. As you've seen, you can go and get a rental property, and if you've got some extra cash, fantastic, sacrifice it and get a tax deduction for doing so, but if it's a bit tight at the moment, you can still go and get that rental property and just use your 9%, so let them do the whole job for you. Less volatile than shares. By borrowing, of course, it does gear up your returns, and we saw that, you know, that 5% appreciation in value, of course, is over a bigger base, so we're getting a bigger and bigger result, but there's no getting away from that. You borrow, and you do choose poorly, you're going to magnify your mistake rather than improve it. So you do need to make sure you do it carefully. And as we've talked about, you are getting effectively a tax deduction for paying off the loan, the actual principal of the loan itself. No other way you can do it.